Good evening and welcome to this evening's feature presentation, our local history spotlight on researching your house's history. My name is Nicole Adams, and I'm the genealogy and local history librarian for the Oshawa Public Libraries. This evening, I'll be highlighting common questions that we get regarding people's properties and the history of those properties. We get questions about when their house was built, who built the house, who lived there before, where was my grandfather's farm, family tree research, and is my house haunted? So these are common questions we get regarding properties in the history of Oshawa, and we have a number of resources available at the library, but also in the wider community that can help you in your search for the history of a property. So, where do you look for this information to find them out? Now, first off, I tell people to begin at home. There might be documents in your house that you're not aware of that have information that can lead you to other resources that'll tell you about the history of your property. Um, and also neighbors and people who might know something about the neighborhood that you're in and the property that you're talking about. There's a property assessment office where you can find information about the legal registration of the property at any time it changed hands. The library resources, which I'll be talking about in depth as well. And this is just an overview of the things I'll be discussing later on in the talk. Land Registry office, where all the documents of the changing of hands of different properties has happened since the beginning of the land registry, back when properties were assigned by the Crown to residents and settlers, and then the land has been subdivided over time. Archives have many records similar to libraries where they talk about the history of an area, and there would be documents, perhaps land documents, newspapers, photographs, various resources that can lead you to finding out more about your property. And City Hall. So, the place where you live, in this case, we're speaking about Oshawa, but there may be records at City Hall within their records that carry information about the history of a property or a house. And also, what I'll be talking about too is making a bit of a distinction. Sometimes the history of a home and the history of a property, meaning the land it sits on, are different, meaning that the history of the home might be documented in certain records, but the history of the property would be documented in other types of records. For example, the Land Registry Office has records about the land, not about the house that sits on it. So, to begin with, you need to look at home. Now, there could be documents in your house that relate to the history of the property that you really haven't looked at or considered. And in the case of older properties in the city, you might have an original building permit. In the case of my grandfather, he had made an adjustment to his property back in the 1960s where he built a porch on the back of the house, which is this is what the scan is of behind this slide. And that happened, the documentation he had to put in with the city to get a permit, and there was a drawing that had to go with that that was approved by an architect, but it had information on that permit about the property itself and what its lot and plan number were within the city of Oshawa. Property assessment and tax bills. So you will get this if you own a property, you'll get the MPAC property assessment, and on that document will be listed either the lot and concession number of the property that you sit on or the lot and plan number if you're in a city or subdivision, and also tax bills that you get, your property tax bills. So the assessment is what comes out telling you what you've been assessed at owing for tax, and the tax bill is what arrives when the payment is due. And so both of those will be referring to your property by its legal description. Now, this is different from the street address of the property. So if you live at 198 Division Street, it is not known as that legally. The legal description is its lot and plan number. And so that's something to be aware of. You can't really look into the history of your property without knowing the lot and plan number. And this is where you need to look at different documentation to give you that information that will lead you to other records further back in time. And also, which township or municipality is the property within? Now, in the city of Oshawa, over time, the jurisdiction and dividing lines between communities has changed. Oshawa was known as a village to begin with, and it was within the township of East Whitby. And over time, as it grew in population, it became known as a town and then as a city. But up until 1974, when the region of Durham was formed, it was part of Ontario County. So not Ontario Province, it's Ontario County. So that got confusing as well for people to know that Oshawa was in the county of Ontario within the province of Ontario, and then became part of Durham Region after the 1970s. And that's the formation of the regional municipality of Durham Region. And also knowing the difference between Whitby as a town and Whitby Township. There's West Whitby Township, where Whitby is as a town, and it's known as the county seat of Whitby Township, and East Whitby Township, which Oshawa was sitting in. So sometimes records might be kept at the county seat. So Whitby might have those records. And I mentioned looking at home, but also important is to perhaps speak to your neighbors. Longtime residents of your neighborhood might know who lived in your house before you, as well as how long the house has been there, or maybe even when it was built, or who built it. So they might have that information, which would give you a bit of a jump start. So ask them about the age of the houses. Oftentimes, neighbors will have houses of the similar age if they were built around the same time. They might even have documentation about their own property, and that would be interesting for you to look at if you think your house is built around the same time. And if you don't have those original documents, maybe they do, and because they're a close neighbor, their property legal description will be very similar to yours, and so oftentimes those records will be very much easier to find if you know that information. And learning about previous owners as well. If they know a neighbor that used to live there and they still have contact with them, you could maybe be put in contact with them to find out about the property and any documents they might still have about the house that they used to own. Now, at the library, we have a number of resources that can help you in tracing the history of a property. Number one is our Vernon's City of Oshawa Directories. These are created by Vernon's publisher from Hamilton, Ontario, and they were created for a number of cities across Ontario. These are also known as crisscross directories, and they're organized alphabetically by both street name and by an occupant's surname or a business name. And you can trace an address backwards in time and find out when it first appeared in the directory. So in our case, we have directories from 1921 to 2001. These are available online. If I'm speaking about directories from other cities in Ontario, some of them may be online and some of them might not. But in the case of Oshawa, we do have them all digitized and available online, as well as in print in our local history room. So sometimes there will be notations to tell you whether someone was the owner or the tenant of the property. It's quite interesting to find a person's name in the directory. Oftentimes it'll list their spouse if they have one, their occupation, their employer, and their street address, so where they're living, in the alphabetical section. If you go to the street directory section, which I've got on the screen here, you can look up a street name, for example, Agnes Street, and to see who lives at what particular address. And beside their name, it either says O or T. O meaning owner, T meaning tenant. But as you go forward in time, this I believe is the 1923 directory up on the screen. But as you go forward through time, some of those notations will change. And we're always available to help you navigate what the information in those directories means. But this can be a very useful tool, especially when we're trying to trace even the history of a street. If I get a photograph in our collection and I know there's a business on that street in the background of the photograph, and I know I can maybe try to find that business in the street directory and see where it was located and see when it appeared there in the directories, I can narrow down when that photograph might have been taken. So, an example, there was a business that was on Simcoe Street, just south of the Four Corners, on the east side. And I wasn't quite sure if it was east or west side. I found it in the directories and was able to pinpoint that, but also found that it only appeared there for 3 years within the directories. So then I could help to narrow down the photograph that I had to that time period, and that could be quite useful for us to use to date different photographs or documents that we get from families that we're not quite sure where they come from or where this business may have been. The directories can be an invaluable resource. Fire insurance plans, or fire insurance maps, as they're sometimes called. Now, these were created originally for insurance companies to know how to assess how much insurance to charge for often industrial properties. So, things where their fire risk would be in the case of factories, foundries, mills, lots of larger buildings within the city. So, you often won't find residential properties in great detail on these. You'll just find them as a little box appearing on the map. You can use these to determine the fire risk, as I mentioned. When major changes took place, agents had to return these outdated plans in order to receive revised plans, and then the returns were destroyed. So This means that there's not a lot of fire insurance plans surviving for different areas of the province. And these fire insurance plans exist across the country, of course. But if you're looking at Ontario research and specifically Oshawa, there's only a handful of them that do exist. We have one particular one we have physically in our collection, and we have digital copies of a couple of others. Now, only developed areas were included in these maps. So it's not a complete map of the whole city showing every last property that existed at that time. It only shows sort of developed areas around often industrial businesses. And because those are the greatest fire risks, you're not seeing maybe the northern part of the city, because of course Oshawa has grown a lot in recent years, but didn't exist much past Roslyn Road in the earlier years, and often was very rural at that point, has only now developed into a larger city. Since about the 70s, it really started to grow in the north end of the city. So none of those properties in that area are going to be noted on the fire insurance plans. It's only in the city center and around the factories, as I mentioned. Now, these can be found in some libraries, archives, oftentimes cities will have them, or you'll see them in provincial archives. In our case, we only have one physical copy, and the Oshawa Archives at the Oshawa Museum does have a couple physical ones as well. And we have digital copies of a few others that are available online or that we've scanned from microfilm that are held at the provincial archive. Now, this is just an example of the Oshawa Fire Insurance Plan from 1894. Um, these were created by Goad, Charles E. Goad, who did them across the country. And so these were quite detailed. So this is what they call the key plan of the Oshawa Fire Insurance Plan from 1894. This shows kind of a legend of which area you would look at further on in the plan, multiple page plan. So you could check the street that you're looking for here, and this might tell you you're in section page 6. So you go for that colored pink area under 6. You go further on onto page 6 and find a more detailed view of properties in that area. This can also show you that the city center, or the town center at the time, would have been quite small. So, for example, you can look at an 1848 and the 1966. 1848, we have digitally. 1966, we do have the physical copies. And you can see this same area, which is just south of where the current Tribute Community Center arena is. So, Emma Street, Hogarth Street, and Court Street, you can see where some of the properties have changed over time. So in 1948, there were a number of properties that were down the right-hand side of the image here on Court Street, and they appear here as well in 1966. And you can see a couple of them have built sheds behind them that weren't there before. But if you look along Emma Street, there's a couple of other properties that were not there in 1948, but that do appear in 1966. So it is showing some of the houses. It does sometimes note the number of the house, so the street number of the house. And it will also, depending on the material that's used to build the property, they will be color coded. So the red would mean brick. Or on this property here, this would mean brick, and this would be a wood house. Now, it's important, and I mentioned this earlier, to know the community history of the property that you're talking about. So, in the case of Oshawa, we began as a village in the 1840s, and then later became a town in 1879, and we didn't become a city until 1924. And also, as I mentioned before, knowing which jurisdiction or municipality or county that your town, village, or city falls under will help you find those records, because that's who would likely hold those records. So even though Oshawa is a city now, you might think all of the documents relating to the city of Oshawa would be within at City Hall, for example, or even here at the Oshawa Library or the Oshawa Archives. That is not the case, because there could be things that relate to Ontario County that are only kept in the county seat, which is Whitby. So documents that you might think only would be held at the city of Oshawa or within the city of Oshawa's library or archive might be held more at the county or even provincial level. So you have to consider all of those divisions. And this is the case for a lot of historical research. To know your geography is always important. So looking at maps and knowing the history of when that map was created and what the footprint of your community was will help you find that information. In the case of Oshawa, as I mentioned, Oshawa itself didn't go much past where you would normally think of as Adelaide Street now. Everything beyond that was quite rural. And I've actually read that when the Oshawa Hospital was built in 1910, where it is now, just north of Parkwood, that it was deemed too far out of town and they couldn't believe that someone would build a hospital that far outside of town. And if you think about it now, it's very close to downtown. But at the time in 1910, the community was thinking it was way too far away. So that gives you an idea of just how far, if you were thinking about Taunton Road or Roslyn Road, how much further that would seem and how rural that actually was. And if you think about properties as well, when land was given in land grants of 200 or maybe 100 acres, those were given out in those lots. And that's what lot and concession refers to, is the original legal description of the property at the time that the original land grant was given. And then every subsequent subdivision of that lot of land was documented in the land registry office records. So on the map on the case here that you can see, it's a bit blurry, unfortunately, but you can see Whitby Township, Whitby Town, and Oshawa Town here. And each of these little grids represents a lot of land. The lots and the concessions are these lines are numbered from right to left, going from south to north. So at the bottom would be the broken front concession, then concession 1, 2, 3, 4. So you think about, you go in the northern end of the city, you think about concession 7, concession 8, those are referring to the legal description and division of property as it existed before. And a lot of the roads that you know now going through the city of Oshawa were once known as concessions and have since been changed to more proper names. Now, we also have historical atlases, many of which have been digitized and are available on a website called In Search of Your Canadian Past, the Canadian County Atlas Digital Project. So we have a number of physical atlases in our collection that you can come in and browse, but they are also available for free online. And what these show is, again, the division of property, and the person who owned the property at that time will be listed on the property. And it will also show where houses may have been. So you can see little squares, which refer to where buildings would have been on the properties. Now, this grayed in area here is what's known as the village of Oshawa in 1877. And the little grid of streets would be the downtown area. But you can see how rural it was just beyond the central core of what is now downtown Oshawa. Everything east, west, north, or south of that was more rural. And you can see all the names of various families that are even well known today having property in these areas. So this can tell you what the lot and concession number is based on these maps. So that can help you then go to land registry office and find out when that property was acquired. The lot and concession number, as I mentioned before, which is the legal description of your property. And this will be useful because the lot and concession number is how the records are organized at the land registry office. Now, the land registry office for this area is in Whitby at Roslyn and Garden. The Service Ontario office there has the land registry records, but they've made a lot of them available online, and I'll be talking about those in a bit. But all of these things I've been mentioning are the steps you can take to get that bit of information. Now, if you'd found your lot and concession or your lot and plan number already on your documents you found in your house, or by talking to a neighbor, or by looking in the city directories, or by looking at the atlases or maps. These are all steps to find that. You don't necessarily have to jump right to the county atlas if you already have a property assessment that has that information on it. Now, this is also an older map, Tremaine map of Ontario County from 1860. So it shows the village of Oshawa in the center, blacked out as a grid there. But you can also see the names of property owners listed on each of these squares. And you see some of them are quite large and some of them are more subdivided. And so those would be like, for example, the east or west half of Lot 5, Concession 3. That kind of description is what would be appearing in the records. And I'll be going through a case study in a moment to sort of highlight how this works in the records. So I mentioned the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, or MPAC. So this is what your document would look like. This is a sample one from their website, but you can see along the bottom here that you can get the location and description of your property. It says 200 Main Street, but it also says concession lot 3, and then it talks about the lot and plan number. So you can see here the lot, location, and description. So it talks about 200 Main Street, but also mentions the concession and lot and plan at the bottom, in which part of that. So it says part 2 of the plan. And this information will be very useful for you later on. Now, going to Land Registry Office, they have historical books, documents, and property title records. And you need to know lot and concession and or planned to get the information from there. You can't just walk into the office and say, I live at 200 Main Street in Oshawa, and they'll hand you a file with all the information about your property. That's not how this works. That's not how the documents are organized. Historically, it's been organized by lot and concession because that's a legal description of the property. So that's kind of a block for some people when they're first looking into the property. It can be quite daunting to use land registry records, but it's getting easier with them being online. So these can tell you the grantee, who is the previous owner, and the grantor, a previous seller. So it tells you all the land transactions when property changed hands over time. Now, you cannot get the date of a building or house from these books. This is, again, about just the property, not about the house. So a city directory might tell you when a house appeared within the city, and you can get an idea of when the house was built from that. But land registry will only tell you who owned the land at a certain period of time. And you can assume from that when they built the house on that land. But these records will not tell you that for sure. Now, it used to be you could go into land registry offices and ask for records and search yourself. Actually, it was very much self-serve, but they closed the public access to these offices in 2020. And now they're putting all the records online, and you can request things that aren't online using some of their indexes and their website. So the website that they use to put their documents online is called OnLand. So you can just do a search for OnLand Ontario records. Provides access to records traditionally found in land registry offices. There's historical books and abstracts, and they can be downloaded for free. And to order full documents, it's $3 per file. So the historical books abstract, which is kind of like an index entry, giving you basic information about a date, when a property changed hands from one person to another, and a few details. And then you have to use the number listed in that abstract to order the full documents, which are $3 per file. And search hours also on this website are limited. You can't just search it 24/7. It's only during the business hours of the land registry office. And the reason for this is because every time a property changes hands, even now, like when you sell a house or buy a house, all the information has to be registered at the land registry office, and they need time for that to update, and you can't have 24 hours access to all records. From what I've read on their website, they need to have time to process all the land transactions that are going in. And also to be aware, these records are not created for genealogists or family historians. They're created for the legal transfer of property. So a lot of people who use these records professionally would be real estate agents. And so those people would always be looking to get documents of titles. Properties may have been divided several times. So there can be subside, south side, or even northeast quarter, or things like that, subdivided over time. This is land registry and not house registry, as I mentioned. And they also have a great tutorial from Ontario Ancestors, which I'll put in the description below, which Ontario Ancestors, previously known as the Ontario Genealogical Society, does a really great overview of how to use the OnLand website and find out information from it that can help you trace your family history or your property. Now, the City Planning Department had to issue building permits, and the city would have records of those and renovation plans and architectural drawings. And these would be organized likely by the property, the lot and plan number, but also by street address. I believe they have them cross-referenced, but you'd have to speak to the city planning department. This is a little less accessible, especially right now, but you can contact them and ask what property information they would have and see what's available. The Archives of Ontario, so this is provincial level, sometimes will have records that maybe normally would have been kept in the city, but have been since moved to the provincial archives. In this case, the assessment rolls and collector's rolls for taxes for Oshawa from 1853 to 1965 were given to the provincial archives by the city of Oshawa back in the 1980s. I guess they either didn't have the space or couldn't store them properly, and they gave them to the provincial archives, who have since microfilmed them. This is really acts as a poll list of the owners by address. So in this case, by property description, so the lot and plan number or the lot and concession number, and showing when people were assessed first and then charged taxes for that property. So those go back quite late, quite early. There's no index of these though, so you need to know the legal description of your property, but then you have to scroll page by page through microfilm, and these are not available online. And the Archives of Ontario is not currently open, but once it is, you'd have to travel to York University, the site of the Archives of Ontario, to access these films. So this is an example of an assessment roll showing the owner of the property on the left side and the lot and concession number, as well as the description and value of the real property. So how much it was worth and various other descriptions of what existed on the property. Now, here's a case study of 198 Division Street. This was my grandfather's house up until January of this year when he sold the house. Had lived there since 1958, but was by no means the first owner of the property. I'll be taking you through some of the documentation about this property. So I knew early on when I started doing this research, this is a number of years ago, that I had to find out maybe who lived in the property before. So I went through each of the city directories. Now he moved in there in 1959. So I checked the year of 1960 to find him listed there and then go backwards through time. So his name is Gilles Brisebois at 198 Division Street. So I went back the year before that to the directory and saw that it was vacant. So there was no one living there at that time. And you'll notice also the little bell beside people's names. That means at that time they had a telephone. Not everybody did have a telephone. So the earlier you go, the less likely you're going to see that. But in these later years, you'll see the bell listed. So you'll see in 1958 back to 1955, there's someone living there named D. Self in 1958, but by 1955, there's no one there. And going backwards through time, I jump back a few decades here, you'll see that there's a Mr. Flinders living there. In 1931, there's a Mr. Hall, who's a tenant. You'll notice it says T and not O. So as you go backwards through time here, you can see that in the 1930s, there were tenants living there. Someone named Flinders in 1932 up to 1954 was a tenant of this house. So it was likely owned by someone else. So if you were happen to find this in the land registry to see who owned it, that person owned the property the entire time and just rented it out. But what shows in the directory is the person who is living at the address, not the person who owned it. The important distinction to make. Going back to 1931, there's a Mr. Hall living there. 30, there's a Mr. Fernie. And going up to the top here again, there's another tenant living there, Mr. Fernie, 1923, Mr. Haskell, 1921. The earliest directory we have is a Mr. Haskell again. So this is the earliest directory we have. So we know the house existed at least by 1921. It was listed in the directory. So that physical property with that physical address was in existence. So we don't yet know when the house was built. So where do we go from here? After going through all the directories, I realized I hadn't talked to my grandfather about any property documents he might have had. Now, he's a bit of a pack rat and keeps a lot of things in the house, including documents, hanging on to things just in case they're useful. And he actually had his tax assessment bill from 1959, which is the very first year he lived there. He had other ones for following years. But you can see here under his name, it lists 198 Division Street, but it also lists the plan, which is 135, L, which is 47, the lot number. So it's plan 135, lot 47, and it tells you the dimensions of the property as well. And it tells you when he was assessed this tax. So this document right here is an example of what I talked about looking at home to see if you have anything like this. It's unlikely they're going to leave you a tax assessment bill. That just happened to be the document that I found. And I'm glad that I found this, but I didn't ask for this until later. So I'd already done a bunch of digging before I got to the point of maybe I should look at the house first. And oftentimes that'll save you quite a bit of frustration. There is a website for Durham Region to figure out what a lot and concession number might be, which can be a great time saver as well if you don't have any documentation at your home. I'll put this down in the description, but you can find the lot and concession number by going to the map and hovering over the area and clicking on the area where your property exists now. So there's a map underneath this blue overlay. And when you click on that particular square, or rectangle, you can see that it pops up Lot 9, Concession 2, which township? Whitby Township. Now, this confuses people when they're in Oshawa. They think, well, this is not, I'm not in Whitby. But you have to realize that the property is in Whitby Township. That's where the documents would be kept. So that's the property description. So that information, you can go from there. Now, this doesn't give you the subdivisions. This only gives you the lot and concession number. So it would have been the original description of the property back when the land grants were first given in the 1800s. And the plan numbers were created when they started subdividing and having towns and villages. So smaller plans of subdivisions. So that's what the plan refers to. It was a planned subdivision of the original lot. Now I mentioned OnLand. This is the Ontario Land Property Records Portal. And I will mention actually before I move on to this slide, with my grandfather's property, it did say that he was Plan 135, Lot 47, but the original lot and concession was Concession 2, Lot 9. So it's important to have both of information. If you're living in a rural property, it's always going to be organized by lot and concession. But if you're living in a city, as this house is, it will also have a plan number. So that's important to keep in mind. So gather whatever information you have, because the plan number only goes back so far as to when the house was built, perhaps, or when that subdivision happened. But before that, the land was likely owned by someone else in a larger lot of land known as a lot and concession. So to go back further from the plan subdivision, you'd have to go back to the lot and concession. So there might be documents in two different places at the land registry office, something to consider. So this is the land registry office's online presence called OnLand. And you first off need to know what your land registry office is. If you typed in Oshawa, it would tell you that Whitby is your land registry office. So you could just type in Whitby or you could type in Oshawa and it will tell you which one you fall under. Then you could click on something called historical books, which is what we're looking for. We're not looking for current information about properties. We're looking for the historical information. So it's historical books. This is an example of an abstract, as I mentioned earlier, the index entry of a property. This is Mrs. Thomas across the top here. This is plan number 135. So going back to my grandfather's property, it was plan number 135. And over here it says lot number 47. So this is the document that relates to, or the index entry that relates to my grandfather's property. Now, the earliest instance, the grant of land, you can see here on the left, it says grant. There's a number here, which is number of instrument. This is the number you'd need to order the full record of that land transaction. And each line is a different land transaction. So in this case, there's a Mary Jane Thomas. This is back in 1913, is when the plan was first created. So this is a subdivision in 1913. So that gives us an indication that the house on the property, the houses in the property were likely built shortly after 1913. So this Mary Jane sells off for, looks like $900, $905 to a, I think it looks like Mr. Giles. But she sells off, so the grantor and the grantee. So the grantor is the person who owned it and selling it to this other person. This is a grant that she gives to him. And it says, but the information that is listed in them, the document numbers are still there. So if you're interested in a name that's mentioned that is crossed out, I would still try to request the record because it probably still exists. And it could just be a clerk's notation that crosses them out for some unknown reason now. But the one I'm looking for is further down, where it lists Olive May Affleck. So she's the person who owns it at the time in 1943. And she then is the one that grants the land to my grandfather. If you see down below here, it has Mr. Brisebois and Mrs. Affleck. It says over here on the left, MRT, that means mortgage. So he got a mortgage to buy the house in 1959. That's August of 1959. It's always a big day in our family to talk about this date. This is the date my aunt was born. So he acquired the house and my grandmother came home from the hospital to her brand new home with her brand new baby. So we always know the date they moved into the house because it's my aunt's birthday. And so you see here that there's the grant of land from the Affleck family. So it says on the estate of Olive Affleck. So she has died, and the family is now selling off some of the properties that were owned by her. And we mentioned before in the city directories, we saw tenants in the property for quite a number of decades. The Affleck family owned the property and owned the properties, different houses on that street, and rented them out to different people. But once she had passed, they sold a lot of the properties to individuals. So my grandfather was one of them. So that's the document here. Now there was a instrument number here, which tells me that there's a file that I can request about this property. So if I then went on to OnLand and I put in that number in the order section, and I got the full document, legal document, between William Nelson Affleck and John Donald Affleck, who were trustees of the last will and testament of Olive May Affleck, late of the city of Oshawa. So they're her they're trustees and executors. And then it mentions my grandfather and my grandmother's names here as who they're selling the property to. And there is a lot more information in this document. For example, a sketch of the property on Division Street. So they're number 198 here along the bottom. And it shows a laneway here, which they do still have the laneway here. It's not a very large property. The house takes up the bulk of the land. There's not a huge lot in the back. But it tells you the width and length of the property as well. And this was they call a semi. So it's, or a duplex house. So it's got like a shared wall with the neighbor at number 200. So that's a little bit of an overview of how to trace property history within Oshawa. This could also be extrapolated for other communities in Ontario. Thank you so much for joining this evening to talk about this topic. I hope if you have any questions, you can contact me at the Oshawa Library. My information is available on the screen. And if you have questions about any of the resources or the websites that I've mentioned, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.